Welcome to Annotations to Art, Politics and Life Itself. My name is Nico. My guest today is Iman Aoun. Iman is an award-winning Palestinian female actor, director and producer, and was a member of the world-renowned El Hakawati Theatre Company in Jerusalem before co-founding Ashtar Theatre, the first theatre school for youth in Palestine in 1991. Iman is also an internationally recognized theatre trainer, specializing in theatre of the oppressed techniques, and is known for her intercultural work and use of theatre as a tool for change. Her vision for creating a better world through theatre has led her to create many critically acclaimed initiatives, including 100 Artists for Palestine in 2003, the Gaza Monologues in 2010, the 1 Billion Rising Palestine campaign in 2014, and the Syrian Monologues in 2015. Iman is also a board member of the Palestinian Performing Arts Network and other Palestinian arts organizations. I can see that she has arrived, so do allow me to invite her in.
Hello.
Hi, I can see you. Good to see you. Iman, thank you very much. I believe you're joining me from Portugal at the moment. Is this correct?
Yes, absolutely. I'm on a tour with the Oranges and Stones play in Portugal.
Excellent. We will talk about this. This is obviously a very sort of current topic and a very timely revival of a production that you have been working with since 2017, I believe. We'll come to that a bit later, but let's sort of start with some background first, Iman. I have already briefly introduced you to our audience. Now you have a long history in utilizing the arts in general, and theatre in particular, to raise awareness about the intolerable situation in Israel-Palestine. It's so on everybody's lips, and it's such a divisive issue at the moment that I'm really very glad that I have you as my guest today, because I think we're bringing a very unique perspective to this. I mean, it's not very often that theatre or the arts are discussed within the context of war and oppression.
That's true. Yes, absolutely. But theater has a very important role to play in such a situation. Of course, Ashtar Theatre is always on the side of the oppressed, because we are, first and foremost, we are Palestinians, and we are living under the oppression day in, day out. And we've been living as such for the last 75 years. So this means that everything that we do, we have our people in our heart, in our mind, and in our perception to help them to overcome and to be able to express themselves, to be able to overcome the traumas, the continuous, ongoing traumas that they have been living. It's like you cannot even start to talk about a trauma in the Palestinian context. It's like it's a chain of traumas that the people are facing all the time. And so part of our major work is to work with the youngsters and youth in order to give them a platform to be able to express their fear, their fury, and their frustration of what is going on, not only now, but in general. It's also a platform where they cement their strength. They look for their internal abilities in order to cope and in order to be stronger human beings, to face atrocities and to face the vulnerability that the Israeli occupation and the oppression is imposing on them. So
let's talk about this a little bit in more detail, because I think for a European audience, unless they are familiar with the subject, I don't think they're quite aware of how restricted life is. There are roadblocks there.
Yes.
So the actual physical reality of bringing people together in a space to work together is already a challenge in many instances. So there are these kind of environmental, physical challenges, barriers, roadblocks, and so on and so forth. And that make it very difficult at times. And then, of course, there are the psychological sort of blocks as well, and the trauma, as you mentioned. And all of this is creating a very challenging environment for somebody like you to work in. So maybe let's start from the outside in. Can you talk a little bit about the physical reality within which you operate?
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for this indication because, for example, I live in Jerusalem, and to go from Jerusalem to Ramallah, which is only like 12 kilometers, which should take only 20 minutes to reach my work. I have to really spend like 2 hours or 3 hours to pass the first checkpoint and then the second checkpoint and then to reach the work, and when I come back it's the same agony, if you want. So my students, because our theater is in Ramallah, so our students who come from the villages and the cities and Ramallah itself, many of them have never seen Jerusalem, which is just, as we said, a few kilometers away. So because they were born with the Palestinian context, if you want, under this separation regime and the apartheid regime that is trying to really make Palestine into cantons and into different bits and pieces. So also not only that the young people and the youth are not able to enter Jerusalem, but sometimes they cannot even see the sea, which is also a few other kilometers to the west, Jaffa and Haifa and all of that. So the whole country had been cut into a visuality of a Swiss cheese block. So only small parts here and small parts there with enormous difficulty. But so the roadblocks that you mentioned, the checkpoints, the separation wall, is internalized psychologically in the psyche of the young people. So when the Europeans, when the Germans think that we are very violent towards the democratic, wonderful country Israel, they are trying to really not see what their action had done to us. They are putting a complete shed on their eyes because they have created the first problem, or they were part of it, and the whole colonial approach of colonial settler regime had continued from now it's more than 200 years that is happening around the world, and still is, but we are the last country to really face the occupation, the colonial settlement occupation, and that's why the fight is so fury and the fight is so strong, and that's why Europe is really supporting the backbone of Israel, and because it's their baby, it's the continuation of their approach about colonialism in the global South. So not to talk politics, but to talk humanistic and artistic. And
Absolutely, but I think it's important to not to get too abstract about it as well, because I think art and theater has to be grounded in reality.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean to understand why a company, an artistic company with excellence, like Ashtar Theatre, would really use political theater, not to be really like, if you say, avant-garde or just didactic theater, but because the essence of the storytelling of our root cause oppression is not solved. And so it is our duty to really tell our story. It is really our duty to express ourselves and to help youngsters and the community to reach out within and also internationally with their own story, because the mainstream media never made it right to the Palestinian cause. The mainstream media that is completely controlled by the Zionist movement and by the colonial powers, they do not want to listen. Do not
I mean,
want.
there's power in theater, isn't there? Because I think theater can, in a way, kind of engage with this or sort of intertwine with this at two levels. It obviously at the level of narrative, and you have done, the kind of the Gaza monologues and the Syrian monologues, and indeed the production we're going to talk about later, Oranges and Stones, again is kind of addressing the narrative aspect. But there is another aspect, I think, and I would like to talk about this first, which has to do with the mechanics of theater, the space it creates, the opportunities for expression, for the experience of freedom as well. And in some ways, and we come to this in the theater of the oppressed, if you like, the rehearsal of rebellion as well. So theater has this kind of narrative level, but it also has a sort of another level, which is more therapeutic or pedagogical or empowering, just as a kind of like, because of the play aspect and because of the interactive and the safe space it creates. So can you talk a little bit about, because obviously I believe theater of the oppressed plays a very central role in what you do, both in a very literal sense that you're using the techniques, but also really kind of, if you like, the philosophy inspired by Paulo Freire, but then of course also by Augusto Boal, and with a kind of empowerment context. And I think, the generation after generation growing up under occupation and oppression, it is quite easy to forget what freedom is.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, to continue from where you stopped, I would say that theater of the oppressed helps us to be critical, and critical thinking and critical approach to life and to politics and to meaning and to social engagement is an important factor. And so theater of the oppressed really help us to ask the right questions, because it is a practice of dialogue. And because that kind of dialogue and turning in the spectators, the receivers of the information, into spectators, into more engaged, more aware audience, help really the formation and the transformation of the audience into people who has a say, people who would have a quest, people who would really be engaged or to look for their own engagement into the problem or into the subject raised. And so that is the philosophy that of the theory of change, if you want, that Ashtar Theatre embody in all its work and into its demarche towards social and political change, whether in Palestine or elsewhere in the world. So, so the fact that we really respect the space of the audience, the space of the colleagues or the trainees, to give them that space to think, that space to put their input into whatever they want to share with us. That is an important factor. And so if you transform the society this way, if you give that kind of possibility for the people to feel their stake in whatever they are doing, then you would reach a point where you have a free society. Because part of the oppression is when you Arash, how do you say, when you take away the freedom of the person, the freedom of choice, the freedom of expression, the freedom of speech, the freedom of reaction, or even of revolution, and this is all had been imposed on us as Palestinians, and so we're trying really to pave a new paveway, a new roadmap for our youth and our society to think outside of that box, to really utilize different ways in order to express themselves. Now, theater in itself, regardless if it is theater of the oppressed or even classical theater, because when you look at Shakespeare, so what is Shakespeare? Shakespeare is all about political theater. He had been presenting the deep human aspects, but in a political context of reigns and kings, and so it is political, because what is not political in the small p, and not, I mean, we're not talking about the politics of the power game of those who govern, but we're talking about the politics of everything, and so it is an important aspect to look at theater as a tool, as a means, as one of these strong possibilities for the nation to be able to thrive.
Now, what I find quite interesting or fascinating and important about the theatre of the oppressed, and you know, more widely about Paulo Freire's kind of, you know, action learning and empowerment methodology, is that oppression is something that it's a bit like colonization. You know, the idea that there is the colonized in Africa and the colonizers in Europe. Yes, that is true. But there is colonization going on within Europe, and there's an interesting discourse going on about what does it actually mean to decolonize. You know, it is as much at a mental and as a level as it is as a structural and so forth. And with oppression, I think there's a kind of there is a sort of a program to this. First of all, you need to recognize what oppression actually is. You know, so the idea that everybody who is oppressed automatically knows that they are oppressed and what that means is, of course, not true. I mean, part of what Paulo Freire did, and then Augusto Boal obviously took it into the theater, was to work with peasants, work with ordinary folk, for them to understand, you know, how and why they were oppressed. Because unless you have an understanding of what oppression actually is and how it affects you, you can't actually begin to actually address it. And nor can you actually seek solidarity with other people who are also oppressed. So understanding oppression, getting a handle on that, seems to be the very first thing that one has to achieve in order to kind of empower oneself. If I don't have a sense of why I am oppressed, or that I'm oppressed at all, then I cannot actually sort of shake off those chains. And I think Theatre of the Oppressed creates that space to explore oppression and what that means, not just in the greater scheme of things in terms of, you know, Israel and Palestine, but also in a very domestic, in a very, you know, very micro context, because of course as you said, a lot of these structures are internalized and, kind of develop a life of their own. So, this is why, like in apartheid South Africa, black communities ended up policing themselves, to a large extent, and so on and so forth. So there is that aspect as well. So liberation starts with understanding one's own oppression. And I think, like the work you do is very much sort of starts at the bottom there, starts to build that up, creates that awareness, and then of course brings an audience into this so that the audience understands too, and that solidarity can build between the audience and the actors, so that everybody becomes a spect actor, as you said earlier, exactly. So this kind of initial step, I found that a really, really important aspect of the theater of the oppressed. And I remember, like, we had a kind of a short exchange a while ago, and I said, how are you doing? And the situation was difficult also on the West Bank, and are you still able to work? And you said, well, it was kind of reduced almost to the psychic interventions. And I thought that was a very interesting and very telling comment, because of course, when you are very restricted in what you can actually do, then you kind of pare it down to the essence, don't you? Can you talk a little bit what that is, and how, in essence, you kind of practice that theater of the oppressed in communities and with your students?
Absolutely. As you said, I mean, the internalization of the oppression is one of the major aspects of or major like fear, if you want, that we face, because many people living under continuous oppression would not know that they are oppressing themselves or the others, and so it becomes a chain of actions where it doesn't stop somehow, and it keeps deteriorating. And so what we are trying to do is to somehow stop that chain, to hold up a mirror, if you want, to our especially our young people in schools, in youth clubs, and in community centers, where we have seen that this is the time really to get into these places and try to make them stop and think, to make them at least look at how they feel. Because one thing that you do usually when you are traumatized is that you shun down your feelings. It's like you start to only project, but you do not really like look internally onto what is happening inside you. And so through drama and through theater of the oppressed, we try to give these different communities a space also to be able to look internally and to discuss among themselves of what is happening to them. It's like, it's also one part that you start to feel ashamed of your feelings, because there's so much happening around you that the atrocities are killing your dear ones, or colleagues, or even your kin, and then you feel like you're not supposed to feel that you yourself is in a bad position, but this is wrong, because you have to be able to be in contact with your inner soul and inner self in order to face and help the others. Because if you're not helped, if you're not aware, as you said before, of the oppression that you're facing, then you cannot really help the others who are under oppression. And so this is the vicious circle that we are trying to break. This is what the theater Ashtar and our colleagues are trying to really do with the different groups. We're not only doing it in the West Bank, we're doing it in Gaza as well. We have our colleagues, the writers of the Gaza Monologues, who are now young men and women. Of course, they all have been they all lost their homes, their loved ones. They're in a devastating position, but to help them to make them at least able to continue the next day and the day after. We had to give them a meaning of the moment, and the meaning of the moment for them as artists is to help others. And so they've been able to really to do interventions in the society, like also other theater companies and other cultural organizations were doing the same with their colleagues and collaborators in Gaza, because that's the only way we find ourselves able to strengthen at least the psychological being of our people in Gaza. And talking about that, I want to really talk about the amazing intervention and the amazing work that they have been doing with the youngsters, with the children, the way they keep the smile, the laughter, the cheer of the moment, the way they are breeding hope is something that we all the world need to learn from that. It's like we are watching the genocide day in day out on the news, but the internal strength of these wonderful artists in Gaza, our artists, those who work with Ashtar, or other artists who are working in general in Palestine, are amazing. It's a lesson to be learned. I mean, you can write volumes about them. Our colleague, for example, Ali Abu Yassin, who's a director who had been working for more than 20 years with Ashtar now, he had been writing amazing text. He had written to Shakespeare. He had written to his library. He had written to the people. He had written to his friends in Europe. He had continued to write, and he is continuing to write every day, talking to the world that many of them are in solidarity with us, and we wholeheartedly appreciate their stand with the Palestinians, and we wholeheartedly understand that what they are doing is not only talking or is not only feeling, but it's action, and solidarity is about action. But many Europeans, unfortunately, they don't want to listen. They're just closing all their senses and their heart in the beginning, looking at Palestinians as a lesser god beings. So, and this is not.
I think this is particularly true of Germans, or a particular strata within German society, I should say, within the kind of the political elites specifically. I think there's pockets in Germany where there is kind of a sense of shame about this German position, but I think it's been oppressed. In fact, there's a whole part of sort of political discourse that's been criminalized in Germany. And we see this on a sort of a really very concrete basis, that institutions that in the past would have kind of given Palestinians a platform, and would have given sort of critical, and these people do exist, of course, critical Jewish voices a platform. These platforms no longer exist. And that is shameful, but I hope it's a transitory kind of phase in German history, and I hope that Germany will learn from the mistakes, the historical mistakes it's making at the moment. I have to be very careful what I'm saying myself, because I don't want to sort of incriminate myself, but this sounds so weird. I mean, honestly, 10 years ago, if I would have heard myself say this, I would have thought this could never happen in liberal Europe. And now you actually have to watch what you are allowed and what you can say in Europe. And this is a really dangerous development in the face of what is actually happening in the Middle East, in Gaza in particular, but also with the settlers in the West Bank. I mean, there's not much information coming through on that either. And it's terrible what's happening. Or the way settlers are systematically stopping aid convoys going into Gaza and all the rest, and the collusion between settlers and the police and the military. This information, I read this in the kind of Anglo-Saxon press. It's not, from what I can see, I don't see it covered in the German press. It's very, very strange. I mean, the German press, in a way, almost mirrors the kind of Israeli press in a weird way, and there is a total blind spot. It's just not there. And the people who do have a sort of a kind of networks and have a dialogue like myself, and there's many of us, we're being silenced, and we have to be very, very careful what we say in public now. But do be assured, I'm with you. Now, it's obviously, I think there's a point, and I think this is also important to say, where the kind of the power of art is limited. There's a point when genocide and when war takes over. And of course, I'm amazed what you say, what is happening in Gaza, that there still are these attempts. And of course, there's something incredibly life affirming about this experience of being creative, of creating something. And that itself is an experience of being alive. And I think when you're surrounded by death and by destruction, that is a very important thing to kind of to sense and to have with you. But of course, that really isn't what theater should be about. This is not, it's not the responsibility of theater to kind of solve this or to in some way cushion it. I mean, it's very honorable, and it's amazing that people are doing it, but they mustn't take it upon themselves as their responsibility. There's a point when there is really, when the kind of oxygen for artistic life kind of evaporates in a weird way. So I totally, I think it's very important also to kind of to acknowledge that. But of course, I think, things are probably ever so slightly better in the West Bank. And I do believe that there are probably, even with all the difficulties and all the kind of increase in aggression and settler violence, I do believe there probably still are pockets where real theater and all of this can happen. And I'm so grateful for the likes of Ashtar to actually keep that flame alive.
Yeah. Well, let me put it this way, Nico. I mean, genocide should not happen. Wars should not happen. I mean, people should really be able to live safely and productively and artistically thriving in artists and non-artists, of course. But when you find yourself in a position like this, art becomes an important tool, an important aspect to really be like the alternative gateway, if you want, to reality, the alternative gateway to hope, the alternative gateway to raising awareness locally and internationally. And this is exactly what is happening. That is the role that we found ourselves doing from October 7th, but this is not the first time. Or hopefully it would be the last, but it is not. I mean, it's been going on like this over years. In 2010, when we wrote the Gaza Monologues and we spread it out to the world, it was about the testimony of 33 young people who had lived the first major assault on Gaza in 2008-2009 for 22 days. And so we thought then, at that time, in 2010, we thought that, wow, this should not be done again. So we have to really raise the voice of the people in Gaza, and especially the children, because children really need to live their life as children, dream, go to school, think of their future. But in 2012, in 2014, in 2016, we lost our theater in Gaza. The Al-Mishal was completely destroyed. 2018, 2020, 2000, every other year in Gaza, there was an assault on Gaza, on the people, and without any prior aggression
I
from
think, I
Palestinians.
think it's interesting. I mean, when you think about art and theater in particular, but not just theater, really the arts in general, there's two sides to this, isn't there? There's like, like if you like art as a public practice, and as a public practice, it requires a public sphere, a public space in which, and that has to be a kind of a safe enough space. Bombs and kind of like sniper fire and all that doesn't really help, to have a public sphere, because people withdraw into their own private spaces. So and of course, the more kind of, sorry,
If they
yes.
have private places, Nico, if they have, because nowadays they are living under tents. There's no private place. They're completely like in the bare emptiness.
Yeah, but the interesting thing is it doesn't actually create a public space either. It kind of deprives them of all space. It's a kind of it's almost as if they're being extinguished.
Absolutely.
Now, obviously, there have been moments when there was more public sphere and there was others when there was less. But of course, the arts also thrive in private spaces and in outside, away from the public eye. And I think some of the work you do would never kind of reach a performing stage, or may never reach an audience, but it still has a very much a role to play as an artistic practice, and as you say, as an empowerment practice in the context of theater of the oppressed. But of course, if you at the same time, it is important to also then kind of find again public spaces, and I think one strategy is what Ashtar is also doing, is to go on tour. And of course, the fact that you've now been able to perform in Portugal is brilliant. And I hope that other theaters around Europe and North America and other places will, listen up and invite you to kind of come to their venues as well, because I think there is an ambassadorial role as well for us to play outside of Israel Palestine, and there may well be a larger stage there for you at this very point in history. But so it's quite timely that at this point, when the kind of the public sphere for Palestinians in Gaza, it's non-existent really, as you say, but even in the West Bank, it's been squeezed to an absolute extreme. That in a situation like that Ashtar can break out and can go on tour. I think this is absolutely important, both in terms of messaging, but also in terms of keeping the flame of the arts alive. Now, so let's move on to the production you've just been has just put on in Portugal, near Lisbon, in the very south. This is a production you're acting in it, and there's a director attached to it, so you're not actually directing it, but Ashtar has been producing it, I believe, and you're acting in it. And it was first produced in 2017, and you've now revived it. It's called Oranges and Stones, and it's a play that basically takes us back to the era of the first wave of Jewish immigration to Palestine. Now, people always think that this happened in the 1940s, but actually it didn't. It goes much, there's a whole thing about where does the timeline start, isn't there? There's all politics about time. But anyway, so this play takes us back not to 1948 or any other kind of date, but it takes us very much back to 1917, when Lord Belver, basically, and when the British government basically kind of came out with this Belver Declaration, that basically decided that the Jewish diaspora should have a national home in Palestine, and that they would encourage, and it was a British protectorate, so they encouraged migration to Palestine, but they also specified in this declaration that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Now, of course, we both know Palestine was not an empty land. There was people there, surprise, surprise. bit like, North America. There was people there as well before Columbus got there. But anyway, we tend to forget. But so, yeah, it was not an empty land. It was actually populated by Palestinians. And there was Jewish people as well. And they lived actually quite harmoniously, side by side. Indeed, there was Christians too. It was quite multicultural in so many ways. But there was, since the mid-19th century, there was a Zionist movement on the rise. Interestingly enough, but that's just, and I don't want to link the two, but there was also fascism actually was rising alongside. And both Zionism and fascism, of course, were blood and soil philosophies. We're basically saying my blood, in the case of Germans, my German Aryan blood gives me a right to have Lebensraum, to have this space. So Germans had this Lebensraum, this living space thing, and that kind of justified the invasion of Russia and everything Hitler did. But of course, alongside that German kind of total delusion about their fascist enterprise, Zionism was on the rise too. And Zionism was all about Lebensraum for the Jewish people. It was kind of almost like, as far as I understand, as you can see, like a mirror image of fascism. In a weird kind of way. And it actually evolved alongside at the same, in the same timeline, in the mid-19th centuries, they both kind of gathered steam. And of course, the British government encouraged that. And so from the kind of early 20th century on, migration, to Palestine took off. In the beginning, in fact, many of the Jews that went there initially, they were refugees. And they were coming from Europe, often sort of war-torn Europe, and they were looking for a new home, and they were actually welcomed. They were treated well on the whole. But it didn't stop there. And the play kind of traces that history from a Palestinian perspective, obviously. And, nobody questions that there would be a Jewish perspective who would tell the story differently, but it's your play and it's your story, and that's entirely legitimate. So you basically tell this story about, about this impoverished migrant, Jewish migrant, who arrives in Palestine from Europe after World War I. And he said it's in the home of a local woman. And I believe in the play, you are that woman, if I understand that correctly, right? Yes. And so gradually he tries to take control of your home and to ultimately expel you or evict you or kind of kick you out. Now, Peter Brook, one of the kind of the all-time great sort of European directors, called this an amazing, magnificent piece of work. So it kind of gives a sort of a sense of, no, this is not just some rebellious kind of backstreet kind of piece of protest. No, this is actually really powerful theater that tells the story of migration and the story of colonization of that part of the world in a quite powerful way. Now, obviously, in the current context, that is a potent story to tell, because for one reason or another, we tend to start, all political discourse at the moment starts with October 7th. Yeah, that's when it all started. That's really, just to get this on the record, what happened on October 7th, I do not condone. I think it's absolutely terrible. Yes, it was war crimes. It should not have happened. It was absolutely unacceptable, no question. 1,200, Jewish people, mainly women, children, so they're terrible, terrible. And then people taken hostage, terrible. So I'm not from one moment sort of saying that there's justification in that. But of course, the backlash to that with 35,000 and counting dead, and I don't know how many people in prison without ever being taken in front of a court or whatever. That's the other side to that story. So within that context.
Do you want me to comment on that, or
you can in the context of the play in a second? Yes, absolutely. So the story really at the moment starts on October 7th with this terrible event, and then of course the backlash and the terrible things that happened since. But you have picked this play up again, and you start much earlier. So what's the thinking behind that, and why do you think it's so potent and so pertinent to do this right now?
Okay. Whew. All right. So the history is long. The history did not start yesterday, did not start in October, as you said. Of course not. The history did not even start 75 years of occupation. The history had started way back in 1897, when the first Zionist movement had made the Basel conference, and they decided then that they need a homeland for the Zionist or for the Jews all over the world, and they started to really think of where they should go, and they had so many countries on the list, and then in the end they picked Palestine because there was a connotation or a connection with religion. Of course, as you said, Jews always lived in Palestine. They're part of the Palestinian context. They're part of the society. They're part of the place, and they consider themselves Palestinians, like Palestinian Muslims and Palestinian Christians and Palestinian atheists and whoever consider themselves Palestinian. Okay. The waves of immigration had started by the turn of the last century. So even before the Balfour Declaration, but and probably the first wave came from Russia. And then in 1917, when the Balfour Declaration was released, giving a place that is not theirs to people that are not part of the place, and not only doing that, when you said the Balfour Declaration said the Jews and the non-Jews. What are the non-Jews? So everybody is like categorized according to being a Jew or not being a Jew. I mean, Palestine was thriving with education, with culture, with agriculture, with industry, with trade, with translation. There were 14 languages, alive languages that Palestine was translating into Russia, into Greek, into English, into French, into like books and schools and missionaries and non-missionaries and theater people and musicians and even cinema. It was a thriving country with thriving people, with very cultured people, that the British mandate, the main occupation that handed the land to another occupation, had done wrongly to Palestine and its people. So what happened is that since 1917 onward, it was quite irreversible that the Palestinian resistance movement who went to the UK, who wanted to see Churchill and who wanted to meet the parliament at that time, were not granted even the time or the possibility to speak in the name of the Palestinian people. So when we see UK now backing Israel, we know why. We know why. And when we see Germany backing Israel, we know why. And so is the US and all the imperialistic Western world, because it is a project. It is the continuation of the early same project. So we know that at the moment, we have to be stronger in terms of meaning and in terms of knowledge. And when you know, you cannot say, I don't know. And this is exactly what we're trying to do with our play. spreading knowledge, spreading awareness. Yes, the man who is a refugee comes into the house of the woman who's the owner of the orange orchard and the place, and it's her house, and she opens up. She opens up her space, her place to the man, but very soon and gradually he gives her the Balfour Declaration, and he starts to really taking her place and parts of her place until he ends up taking everything and kicking her out. Now, it is also a straightforward question to the international audience. You have seen and you are watching. What is your role?
No, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And there is, going back to this notion of oppression, and that you have to start, there is Germany has this sort of like this kind of culture of remembrance, and it's very proud of it. It's making a big deal of it, and quite rightly so, because there is a recognition that we mustn't forget the horrors of the Holocaust and the Second World War and all the rest. And I totally support that. I think that is the right thing to do, and the British and the Americans and all the rest could learn a great deal from that culture of remembrance, and kind of trying to understand the mistakes and so forth. This is partially, I think, why it's so inexcusable, why Germany, in the case of Israel, Palestine, is so blind. I just don't really quite get it, because when you look factually at the history of this part of the world, it's, from what I can see, very much the story you are telling. And I think, I wouldn't for one moment say that the Jews have to go away. That's not, I don't think, is a solution, nor is it realistic, nor will it ever happen. But that's not also what I think anybody should ask for, in my view, should ask for. But what needs to start is a sort of a sense of that mistakes were made, that, this was not a kind of a history of one side getting it right and the other side getting it wrong. And this is, and this kind of process of reevaluating, of getting the story straight, or kind of basically kind of telling the narrative, I think very much what you're doing here. And I think this is really, really important. And I think it's very, very difficult, of course, both for Israel and for Jews, but also for Palestinians, to move beyond the current crises without actually coming to terms with that history. Because for as long as there are two histories that are incompatible, I do remember there was a very, very interesting moment in South Africa, because if you take Winnie Mandela, which was very different from Nelson Mandela, she kind of was very heavily involved in the armed resistance and all the rest and so on and so forth. She was also a very different kind of person from Nelson Mandela, and she was really vilified. She was sort of seen as evil in white circles anyway, yeah, and she clearly appears to have been involved in some really rather gruesome killings and all the rest. So that's Winnie Mandela, and Nelson is that saint. And it's very, very interesting when you talk to South Africans, there is a sort of a sense that there's a sort of a white truth and a black truth. And the white truth goes a bit like this: yes, I understand, but, and that comes to but, because there is a sort of, there's a sort of a sense that oppression kind of creates a certain dynamic which has to be taken into account in evaluating. It's a bit like what you said earlier. If the Palestinians are portrayed as these violent people, they're not. For starters, they're not. That's obviously kind of a totally wrong portrayal. But yes, there have been violent instances, and yes, there have been terrorist attacks. But you're quite right in sort of saying that you have to place that in context. You have to place it within a historical sort of timeline to understand. Because if you don't start to kind of try to understand, yes, please go on.
No, I just want to state, which is also very important, the words that we choose in this. You've been using certain sentences that I don't reckon, or that I don't agree with, which when you say, okay, Palestinians had been using violent actions, or you call it terrorist actions. But I do not reckon, of course, because what about the terrorist state of occupation? You said hostages. How many Palestinian hostages had been taken into the prisons of Israelis? Thousands and thousands and thousands of people had been in prison. So are these hostages, or are these only prisoners or political prisoners? Some of them are kids of 9 years old, of 12 years old. I mean, when we choose our words, we have to be careful what we say, because we should not be saying the rhetorics of the international media or the international politics. For me, there is misinterpretation of the Palestinians and their struggle. We've been under occupation for such a long time. Nobody wanted to even listen to us and give us our rights. Even when the Oslo Agreement, which is very bad and which was completely deteriorated by the Israelis, like a few years afterwards, when they killed. Oh, sorry. I couldn't even remember the name. I'm so sorry. But the prime minister. What happened is that we always stigmatize the Palestinians. We always, because Palestine is not a strong country, because Palestine is not being recognized by the Western world. This is historical crime that I do not want to be part of this consent. I don't want to be in an interview that would stigmatize my people and my country as such.
Oh no, 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 sorry. So if this was not my intention at all. I was basically sort of at that point presenting, if you like, the other side of that story, and it clearly is the case that certainly most of Israel and many people in Europe and the US would consider these acts as terrorist acts. Now you see that different. I can totally understand that, but I think this is exactly the problem when you have a Palestinian truth and when you have a Jewish truth. This is a bit like a black truth and a white truth in South Africa. And the question is, how do you actually kind of, in a way, kind of solve this? How do you somehow break through this? And I think theater has a very central role in this to play, because theater doesn't ask you to kind of argue it out with your opposite number. Theater asks you to tell your story in a kind of an authentic and a truthful way. And of course, it also asks the audience to give you the opportunity to tell that story and to engage with it in a kind of honest and so forth way. And I think that's the power. And I think in a way, somehow, this is, I think these two truths will coexist for some time. And people like yourself are great ambassadors of one of the one side of that story. And it's going to be in part down to your skill and your talent and so forth, and also your resources as a theater producer to kind of get that story out.
But as a German, and the question is for you and beyond you, would you accept the Nazi story or point of view against a Jewish point of view at the time of Nazism?
Well, the thing is, I mean, this is something, yeah.
I don't want you to answer it, but would you accept a Nazi point of view against a Jewish point of view at the time of Nazism? That is an important aspect, because it's about right and wrong. It's about oppression and complete deterioration of another people or because you feel that you are stronger and because you feel that you have the right to have a nation, or to have the power, or to have the whatever whatever status or situation.
Well, I mean, this is a really important point because, of course, part of my life story is that I left Germany as a young man, and I spent most of my life outside of Germany in the UK. So I don't really so fully identify with being German. I spent 30 years away, but have asked, of course, you know, the moment you are abroad as a German, you're confronted with this head on straight away. I remember, like, when I first was in Belfast, you know, I was in a very deprived part of Belfast, and the local kids would always warn me when there was kind of like some trouble happening, because this was before the Good Friday game. And they would, the moment that I was German, they would call me Hitler. They would say, Hitler, Hitler. You know, that's what they called me, because I was German, and I thought that was really funny. In the beginning, I was really terribly ashamed of that, but I thought, after a while, I thought it was funny too. So you know, like, the thing is this is, you know, at that point I began to wonder, well, for as long as Germans have this kind of like sense that yes, Hitler was absolutely bad, there's no question about that. Everything the whole fascist movement stood for is absolutely, you know, can only be rejected, is wrong. But the problem is, if we don't allow ourselves to try to understand it, look, why would it be that so many people fell for it? Surely it had to be attractive in some ways. You know, the uniforms clearly were sexy. When you look at them today in second-hand shops, they look dusty and funny. But at the time, they were really cool. And it goes on and on and on. The kind of the photography of Leni Riefenstahl was really attractive. The geometry, the kind of Romanesque kind of architecture. You know, clearly there was something very, very hypnotic, something very engaging, something very aspirational about fascism. For so many, remember, Germans didn't capitulate. It wasn't like, you know, Hitler was not like Mussolini. Mussolini was hung up and killed at the end of the war. No, Hitler wasn't. There was like 13-year-old boys defending the bunker of Hitler in Berlin at the end. You know, there was never, Germany never gave up, you know, and so they never really left that behind. Only later were they kind of re-educated. But there is unless we begin to try to understand what was so attractive about it, we can't prevent it from happening again, because we don't really understand what the dynamics of it are. And we see the rise of the far right in Europe and in Germany now again. And when we look at the way when I look at the way people talk about this, I kind of feel it's so besides the point. You know, those kind of very sort of centrist or whatever kind of bourgeois people talking about those terrible right-wingers and, you know, whatever. They don't understand what drives and motivates them, you know, where they come from. So I think, yes, absolutely. I think it's important to try to understand Hitler and where people came from, and not to kind of put them, you know, out. And the same thing, of course, I would say goes for any conflict. It's like, unless you understand why Palestinians feel the way they do, how can you ever honestly engage with Palestinians? Unless you understand how Jews feel, and it goes on and on. But of course, it's a very, very, very hard task to ask you to do, because the pain that you've been put under is so enormous and historical and so long running.
But we are the Jews of Germany at the time of the Nazis. It's not that we are the Nazis vis-a-vis the Israel at the time. And this is what is different. We feel that we are the Jews of what is happening, or we are this. The assimilation is like that we are at the moment, like the Jews that were in Germany at the time of the Auschwitz and the Nazi Germany. And
well, I think I mean, I wouldn't accept the direct sort of like comparison. I think, you know, and for very obvious reasons.
Not for you, but this is how we feel.
I accept that, but what I do kind of like agree with you is that there is a sort of a level of dehumanization, you know, a level of, you know, sort of, you know, where a desensitization, where, you know, where Palestinians can be treated in a way I mean, I wouldn't even say like animals, because people don't really treat animals that badly, but they can be treated in such a bad way without actually raising too much. I mean, what's happening in Gaza at the moment should lead to absolute massive outrage across Europe and the US. It's hypocritical, the position countries like Germany take. How can they? They just have to see what's happening. But we're so dehumanized that the life of a Palestinian, let me put it the other way around. It seems to be a case where the life of one Jewish person is worth the life of 300 Palestinians. I think that's about the ratio at the moment, of 350, in fact. So this is just terrible, and that level of dehumanization is absolutely something that the current situation has in common with what happened in Europe in the 1930s. But there's other aspects where I don't think the comparison really holds so well. But let me say this, we don't need those historical comparisons. We can literally just look at what's happening right now in Israel-Palestine. And what I find really the importance from my very humble and not really so super educated point of view here, but what I find really important, you mentioned this earlier, is that we look at really at the last big colonial project. I mean, South Africa was the other one, and now it's not at all surprising that South Africa would take Israel to the International Criminal Court, International Court of Justice. So it's not entirely surprising, because there's obviously sort of a sense of, I don't know, solidarity, or sort of a sense of understanding that many other nations, especially in Europe, seem to lack. But that's so absolutely. I think solidarity with Palestine is absolutely important, and so is, of course, also solidarity with Jews. That's not the same as sort of saying Israel, because this is a conflation that I kind of find very difficult. I mean, one can be absolutely solidarity, show solidarity with Jewish people worldwide, and still, kind of condemn what Israel is doing at the moment in Gaza. I think the two things are not a contradiction.
Jewish Voice for Peace and Jews for Justice, and as we said, we do not have a conflict with Judaism or the Jews. I mean, the problem on the ground is a political problem. It's a colonial problem. It's an imperialistic problem. It's the problem of putting one nation in the place of another nation on a land that belonged to the Palestinians. So that is the problem, and so when we are against the Israeli occupation, we are against that project. We're not against the individual people or the Jews as Jews, because there are many Jews who are part of the resistance movement in general around the world, and look at them in the US, for example. So yes, going back to theater, going back to the fact that theater is an important aspect, that theater is part of keeping the human aspect of our being, of our essence on this earth alive. Because as Boal once said it, I mean, we started to become humans when we started to realize who we are, when we started to look at our actions and being aware of them and realize them and realize who we are as an entity vis-a-vis what is surrounding us. So that's what makes us human. It's not what party do I belong to. It's not how much power or money I have. It's more how much I am aware that we all belong to one part of this cosmos, which is the Earth. And now we're trying as human beings to invade other planets. Where now the project is not invading other lands on this Earth, but it's invading other planets outside of it. And the project is becoming more and more vicious and more abstract and difficult, because where to stop and where to begin, really. There's always the macro aspect, but there will continue to be the micro, the individual, the small community, the group of people, the one society or one nation, etc., etc. So as artists, we have to really look at the micro all the time, and look for the happiness, or look for the beauty, the aesthetics, or look for the critical eye also on what is right and what is wrong, as we when we started to talk about it in this interview. But so yeah, I think we have to keep on the card of not losing our humanity, because in every corner we can find a possibility. In every even in every bad thing, we can have a speck of light, and vice versa. Personally, I do believe in Taoism, and I think that there's nothing that is totally right and totally wrong. There's always a possibility of finding cohesion, and finding the utmost possibility of making change that would allow us to be more humane, and more just, if you want. Yeah, and maybe it is the time now to think of justice, and maybe it is the time for Europeans to really accept the fact that Palestine is a nation. It should be a country, a sovereign country, that Palestine deserves to be fully and completely recognized.
I
Because
mean, Iman, to be honest, I think this has been such a cathartic, such a terrible explosion of inhumanity, of brutality, that I think a clear consequence will be, and we see the sort of the tectonic plates shifting. We see really a change in the US, the way a lot of young people in the US look at Israel-Palestine. The Biden administration has got great difficulty kind of keeping that together. Like on the campuses, but also in the streets, there's a strong, the kind of the Black Lives Matters kind of like campaign seems to have spilled over into sort of a Free Palestine kind of movement. So this is happening in the US. I also feel strongly that the kind of oppression and the sort of the kind of censorship that is currently keeping Germany, in place is not sustainable, and there are increasing critically voices coming out as well. And I think some of the stuff that I've said earlier during this interview, I'll probably come to regret, but there you go. But so I think we are seeing, finally, I think we are seeing the beginning of a new era for Israel-Palestine. And I think, as brutal and as unforgiving and as terrible it is, and as tragic as it is, there is also, in my view, a glimmer of hope that out of this kind of total catastrophe, this total nothingness, that something new can be born. We've seen this after the Second World War. There's been a lot of goodwill on all sides to establish the UN and, the human rights charters, this, that, and the other. And I think we may well have another one of those historical moments where some real change will have to happen, and where kind of key players will make that happen. Now, I think Ashtar, let me just to get to this point, I think Ashtar has a critical role to play in that transition. And so I would like to end on this kind of question of, let's just kind of look beyond the current carnage and the current situation. And where do you see Ashtar's role in moving forward into a new Palestine, into new Israel-Palestine, whatever the future might hold?
first of all, let me correct one terminology. it's called Palestine. And if you want, it's Palestine with a question of Israel. But it's not called Israel Palestine, at least when you talk to me, please. Okay, so for me, Palestine is when everything would happen, and like a phoenix, we hopefully that we would rise again. There will be a continuation of work that never stopped. We will do one thing that is at the moment important is that we're trying to create a new way of sustainability, not only for Ashtar, but for many more organizations, which is to be backed away from the colonial money of keeping the status quo of coma, a political coma in Palestine. But we're trying to really create a new way of subsidizing, funding the arts, more connected with the community or with the solidarity movements and with people who are able to support us internationally and locally. Now, we are a school of theater, and we will continue to teach theater for our youngsters and youth. We are a professional theater company, and we will continue to do professional plays. At the moment, we are doing a new play under the name Guernica Gaza. So that two prominent writers have written, Naomi Wallace and Ismail Khalidi. So, and Emil Saba, the director and the artistic director of Ashtar Theatre, will be directing this with a group of young professionals. So, so this play is will be starting to tour. At the moment, we have also Oranges and Stones that has a tourney in Europe, in France, in the UK, in Italy, in South Africa, and hopefully that it will continue to tour. We also have another production talking about the cultural differences between living in Jerusalem and living in France for one of the artists. So there are many plays. Hopefully that we will be continuing, because we believe that what we are doing is important for our community, and as soon as we are able to rebuild in Gaza, that is another aim for Ashtar, is to help our theater community and theater group, our colleagues, to find their space again in Gaza and maintain the work. So, because we believe that theater could be one of the most important interventions to heal young people and adults as well, of course, because as we said before, theater speaks to the heart, speaks to the mind, and speaks to the body, because trauma would find places in your physical body and in your mind, and will deteriorate your spirit. So theater would be the one of the strongest ways to revital our spirit and to grant to grant a possibility of checking oneself and proceeding further in life, because as psychologists were putting it the other day, that Gaza would need 70 years only to recover psychologically.
Yeah, I mean the entire infrastructure in Gaza is also destroyed, and the universities and the schools and the hospitals and everything. So yeah, just rebuilding that will take a long time, and then of course a whole generation of youngsters will be without education in the meantime, or with limited education. It's a terrible, terrible tragedy. Iman, I'm really, really grateful that you've been able to take time to talk to me. There's always a kind of a sort of a certain gulf between like a European and a Palestinian, especially a Palestinian who lives in Ramallah in Palestine, and has quite a different perspective from a European, certainly from me. But I do hope that there's enough, if you like, of a common ground here to develop that dialogue and to stay in touch. I absolutely support what you're doing. I think the work you're doing is incredible, and I believe that you probably also take donations. I'm not sure whether you have a facility to take donations on your website, on the Ashtar Theatre website.
I can share with you the QR code of our psychosocial intervention in the West Bank and Gaza, and so people could really donate on that if they like. There's also the bio where people could really get into it and check all our work and try to see where they like to connect with us, and we're all the time looking for friends and partners, and we're open. We don't really limit ourselves to anyone.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Iman, thank you very, very much. Now, what's your immediate plans? You kind of finished now in Portugal, I believe, or do you have further shows coming up?
Yes, absolutely. Tomorrow we're performing in Corbella,
Oh, nice.
in northern Portugal, and then next week in Lille, and then in Paris, and we will go back home and then again to the UK for a tour in Liverpool, in Oxford, in London, in Newcastle. So hopefully.
Excellent. I'm really, really glad to see that you're out and about and that you're kind of keeping up and the good spirit and yeah, and keep telling, the story of Palestine, which I think is a really important story to be told in this dark situation right now. Iman, I'm really grateful that you're here. And I wish you all the best. And thank you very much for taking all this time to talk to me. Yes, I will speak to you again very soon.
Thank you so much. I mean, I'm really glad that I was also uh, invited to be part of this wonderful talk. So and of course, I'm glad that if the people would be listening to us, and there will be as I said, the QR code of checking Ashtar Theatre, and they are most welcome to follow us.
Excellent, absolutely. If you send that to me, I'll stick that under the video, and then people can easily access it that way. And obviously the link as well, because the link works better with the podcast.
Absolutely. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you
Great.
very, very much, and I'll
Thanks.
talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.